Welcome to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any breaking news or episodes. Today we're talking about one of the most important DC films collectors are going to be watching very closely this year, and honestly one that I'm super excited about and that could have major implications for the long-term Supergirl market. Supergirl releases end of June, June 26th as a matter of fact, and this movie feels very different from previous attempts to bring the character to the big screen. Not just because of the casting, not just because of the direction of the new DC universe, but because this feels like the first time in a long time that DC is trying to position Supergirl as a major centerpiece character instead of a supporting extension of Superman. We just haven't seen that before. And so whenever a studio starts repositioning a legacy character like that, comic collectors pay attention. That's new news. That's something interesting. Now, the movie itself already has a lot of curiosity surrounding it because of the tone it appears to be aiming for. For everything we know so far, this isn't being built as a light, overly polished superhero movie. It sounds much more emotional, more cosmic, and honestly more strange, but in a good way. The film is reportedly drawing inspiration from the Woman of Tomorrow storyline, which portrayed Kara Zor-El in a much harsher and more emotionally scarred environment than most mainstream audiences are used to seeing. And that matters because character reinvention often drives collector interest more than simple nostalgia does. If audiences connect emotionally with this version of Supergirl, collectors may begin reevaluating just how important Supergirl keys actually are in the broader DC hierarchy. Now, the casting is a big part of why people are optimistic. Milly Alcock is stepping into the role of Kara Zor-El, and so far she has fit in very well for the direction DC seems to be taking. She has the ability to balance vulnerability and intensity at the same time, which is important because Supergirl works best when she feels emotionally layered rather than just female Superman. Her story has always been different from Clark Kent's story. Superman traditionally represents hope, stability, and optimism. Supergirl, however, often carries more anger, more isolation, and more emotional conflict because of the trauma attached to losing Krypton at a more conscious age. She remembers more. She feels the loss differently. And if the movie leans into that emotional weight correctly, it could completely change how mainstream audiences view this character. But then there's the other huge piece of this movie that collectors are already talking about nonstop, and that's Lobo. Jason Momoa playing Lobo is one of those casting decisions that almost feels inevitable in hindsight. The energy matches perfectly. Lobo is loud, violent, sarcastic, chaotic, and larger than life. And Momoa naturally carries that kind of screen presence already. And honestly, the inclusion of Lobo may end up helping the movie more than people realize because it broadens the audience appeal beyond just traditional Superman family fans. Lobo brings in comic fans who like cosmic DC stories, anti-heroes, darker humor, and more unpredictable energy. That creates crossover interest between different parts of the collector community. And crossover attention often helps comic markets significantly because it expands the number of people researching related books. Now, obviously, Lobo collectors are already watching books like Omega Man 3 very closely, but what's interesting is how his involvement may indirectly boost attention towards Supergirl books too. Because if the chemistry between Supergirl and Lobo becomes one of the breakout elements of the movie, then the entire ecosystem surrounding the film benefits from the increased visibility. Which brings us to the book that's at the center of this entire conversation, Action Comics 252, The First Appearance of Supergirl. This is one of the most historically important DC Silver Age books, and honestly, I think many collectors underestimate how significant it actually is. We're talking about the introduction of one of the most recognizable female heroes in comic history. This isn't some niche first appearance or secondary side character, by the way. Supergirl has existed in DC mythology for decades across comics, animation, television, and now major films, and yet, Action 252 has often lived in an interesting space within the market. It's respected, it's expensive, and serious collectors absolutely understand its importance. But it has not always received the same level of mainstream collector obsession as some other mega key Silver Age books. That could start changing very quickly if this movie succeeds. Because what media adaptations often do is they remind collectors and casual audiences alike which characters truly matter historically. Once a character breaks into the mainstream conversation again, people naturally begin tracing that character backward through comic history. And when they do that with Supergirl, Action Comics 252 is the destination. What makes the book especially important historically is the timing of its release. Supergirl debuted during a period when DC was heavily expanding and modernizing its superhero universe during the Silver Age. There was a growing push to evolve legacy characters and broaden the Superman mythos, and Kara Zor-El quickly became one of the most important additions to that world. The cover itself is iconic as well. Superman introducing Supergirl to the world has become one of those instantly recognizable Silver Age visuals that collectors gravitate toward naturally. And iconic covers matter a lot in media cycles because newer collectors tend to connect first with visuals before deeper historical context. Now, from a market standpoint, Action 252 already behaves like a major key as it is, but what's interesting is that desirability can evolve even when a book is already expensive. That's just something people misunderstand sometimes. Not every important comic needs a sudden price explosion to become stronger. Sometimes the bigger shift is tightening supply, stronger competition for higher grade copies, and increased long-term demand from newer collectors entering the market. And honestly, that may be exactly what happens here. If Supergirl resonates emotionally with audiences, especially younger viewers or viewers unfamiliar with the character's deeper comic history, Action 252 could become one of those books that collectors begin treating less like a good key and more like an untouchable cornerstone book. And media-driven demand often starts with emotion before it becomes financial. People watch a movie, connect with a character, and then they start researching. They want to own a piece of the origin. They want the first appearance. They want the historical connection. That emotional pathway is what drives a lot of major comic demand cycles. Now, another thing working in Action 252's favor is generational familiarity. Supergirl isn't a brand new character here, being introduced for the first time. Different generations already know her from different versions. Some fans grew up with the comics. Others know the animated versions. Some know the television series. And now a new audience may discover her through the DCU films. When multiple generations connect to the same character through different entry points, it creates layered demand, and layered demand is usually very healthy for long-term key stability. We all know that. In addition, it's clear that DC understands how important this movie is strategically. The new DC universe needs characters beyond Batman and Superman to become emotionally important to audiences again. That's what Marvel did well. If Supergirl works critically and commercially, it signals that DC can successfully expand its universe using emotionally grounded storytelling rather than just spectacle. And if that happens, Action 252 becomes even more culturally important because it represents the beginning of that character's legacy. Now, personally, I think one of the biggest things collectors should watch after the movie releases isn't necessarily immediate spikes in raw prices, it's availability. Do higher grade copies become harder to find publicly? Do auctions become more competitive? Do collectors stop letting go of copies because they suddenly feel more important culturally? Those are often the early signs of a strengthening key. Because sometimes the biggest indicator of a book's future isn't that prices explode overnight, it's that owners become less willing to sell. And if this movie lands the way DC hopes it will, I would not be surprised at all if Action 252 starts entering a different level of collector conversation over the next year or two. Not just as the first appearance of Supergirl, but as one of the defining female superhero keys in the entire Silver Age DC market. Thanks for listening to this episode of Slabbed Portfolios. I hope you continue to find this information helpful, and I'll see you guys on the next one.